One of the basic misunderstandings that I think many Christians have is that we think that God gave us the freedom to choose between good and evil. But God never gave us that freedom. We claimed that freedom for ourselves from God. We not only demanded it for ourselves, but we have claimed for ourselves also the right to decide between what is good and what is evil. That's the essential feature of the story of Adam and Eve. Adam and Eve, as I've mentioned many times, overthrew God because they wanted the authority to discern good and evil. The serpent says to him, I've got a slide for this, Liz, for God knows that when you eat from it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. You will be like God. You will be God, knowing good and evil. You will be God, deciding what is good and what is evil. But there's a problem in all this. We are not like God. We are fragile, frail creatures that live contingent lives, never seeing the big picture. We don't always know good from evil. We truly don't know always and cannot always distinguish good from evil. And we can easily delude ourselves into believing that what we think is good is actually good, and what we think is actually evil. But if you could have had lunch with a high-ranking official of the Third Reich in 1944, and the conversation had gotten around to the Jews, I think the thing you would have found most bewildering in this conversation is that this Nazi Party official would have been convinced, absolutely convinced, that the elimination of the Jews was a morally correct decision to make. They would have been convinced that the Holocaust was morally justified. The final solution of the Jews was hidden from most Germans through most of World War II, but that was a practical decision made by Hitler's government because they didn't want the blowback from large parts of the German public if it had been found out what they were actually up to. Most Germans would have found the idea of the extermination of the Jews a morally repugnant program. And this repugnance would have been a blowback against the Nazi regime. Now, this repugnance that most Germans would have had to the Holocaust was a derivative of their Christian ethic and their love for their brother and sister, this idea of loving one's neighbor. So the Nazis hid their intentions and the actions of the Holocaust, the final solution, from the public, but they did so for pragmatic reasons. At a dinner table, having a frank conversation with a high-ranking Nazi official, there would be no doubt in their mind that eliminating the Jews from Europe was the morally correct decision. The Holocaust to them was justified because it was necessary, a necessary attempt to purify the human stock from its degenerate strain found in the Jews. They would have seen it as a necessary step in the evolution of the human species. This type of fundamental moral failure has happened again and again and again and again in human history. It happened during the early years of the communist revolution in Russia, when 20 or 30 million people died. And the Communist Party had no qualms about this program that they were introducing into the country and that it led to so many deaths. This happened in communist China. Probably 40 or 50 million people were killed by the Communist Party as it took over the country. The Khmer Rouge believe in the moral rightness of all those killings that have come down to us in history. All those killings that were needed of people who were interfering with the proletarian revolution that they had initiated. In Cambodia, the Khmer Rouge killed 2 million people of a country of 8 million. That means 25% of the population was wiped out by the Khmer Rouge. 1 in 4 people. That's like 25 of you just disappearing in this congregation. If you had spoken with a high-ranking member of the Khmer Rouge during this period, they would have been adamant that they were embarked on a morally righteous crusade, and that the death of all these people was a necessary condition for the advancement of their revolution. Slave owners in the United States, in the southern states, back in the 19th century, believed in the righteousness of their enslavement of African people. They convinced themselves that enslaving other human beings was a morally responsible thing to do. And they're not the only ones who believe this. What about all the African tribes who sold those slaves to the Europeans? They must have been also justified in their moral thinking as well, that what they were doing was justified and right. I was watching an episode of Adam 12, which is a police show from the 60s and 70s. And there's this one little scene, this little vignette where this guy gets arrested for sexually assaulting a young woman. And he's blaming this woman for his behavior. He's saying that she asked for it from him, that she was enticing him, that he was morally justified in sexually assaulting her. He took no responsibility for his activity and his decision. This attitude plays out in life again and again and again. We justify our words and our actions based on our own assessment of right and wrong. This happens when we assume the role of God in our own lives. When we take it upon ourselves to decide what is moral and what is not moral. Toronto Metropolitan University is opening a new medical school. I don't know if you saw the news about this, but their initial plan was to segregate 75% of the new 90 medical spots and only allow what they call disadvantaged people to apply for these positions. Indigenous, Black, and other equity-deserving groups to apply. That's what the 75% was going to be segregated for. Now, I think we would all agree that it would be an advantage to have a wide spectrum of people as medical doctors. My own family doctor is a middle-aged woman from India. She's an amazing doctor. I think we all agree that diversity is a good thing. I think we all agree also, I hope at least we all agree, that helping people who have been disadvantaged in life to gain access to opportunity is a good thing. But I thought we had agreed years ago as a society that discriminating on the basis of sex or race or creed or gender or a host of other features was wrong. So how do we fix the problem of historic discrimination with more discrimination? It just makes no sense to me. How do we advance ourselves in the goals of becoming a moral and just society by engaging in practices that are obviously immoral and unjust? Yet people convince themselves that this approach is just. I saw an interview with the head of the TMU medical school, and he was convinced that this approach he was taking for the school was morally justified. I noticed that the Archbishop of Canterbury has recently resigned for failing to properly report the abuse of children in the care of the church. This particular situation, the details at least, seem less obviously odious than past circumstances, but there's so little trust in institutions today. And leaders like the Archbishop of Canterbury don't get the benefit of the doubt anymore. Of course, the reason for this was that in the recent past, various churches have chosen to protect the reputation of the institution and over against their responsibility to protect the innocent. That's where this whole thing comes from. Churches hide the abuse against children in order to protect their own institutional reputation. And I'm absolutely convinced that if we'd gone back 50 years and we were having a lunch with a high prelate in a major denomination, and we were talking to them about the relative responsibilities of protecting the institution's reputation versus protecting the innocent, that they would feel morally justified in favoring the institution's reputation over and against the protecting of innocent people, vulnerable people. The Bible never tells us that God intended that we were to have the freedom to decide upon good and evil. It never says we were meant to be moral agents in life. That's something we claim for ourselves. It's something that came to us when we overthrew God. In fact, it's the very reason we overthrew God in the first place. We want to be our own moral agents. And we claim the right to decide for ourselves what is good and what is evil. And you just have to look around the world today to see where this has taken us. What the Bible does say is that we were created to live in a deep and immediate relationship with God. And it was in this relationship that God would reveal to us what is good and what is evil. That was the plan. At least that was the plan until we overthrew God from our lives. From a biblical point of view, our one and only real decision to make, our one and only profound, fundamental decision to make in life is whether we will accept the lordship of God in our own life circumstances. Are we going to accept God as our moral agent, or are we going to instead replace God with ourselves and become our own moral agent? See, we get to choose who and what we surrender ourselves to. We can surrender to God, or we can surrender to our own desire to be God. We can submit to God, or we can ascend into God's place and decide for ourselves what is right and wrong. To follow Jesus Christ is to surrender our claim to our right to ourself. That is discipleship in its simplest form. We put ourselves back under the authority of God when we follow Jesus. Our walk with God is therefore one of surrender. Now, there are lots of tangents in this journey with the Lord. There are lots of interesting aspects of what it means to walk with Jesus. But at its heart, it is a journey of surrender. We give up trying to be our own moral agent, and we allow God to show to us what is good and what is evil. Now, that's an easy thing to say. It is a profoundly difficult thing to do. Why? Because we believe in the absolute clarity of our own moral frame. We trust our own moral frame. We trust in the knowledge that we know good from bad. We trust in the knowledge we know good from evil, right from wrong. We have total confidence in our ability to mediate this part of life. We don't need any assistance from anyone, even and including God. We don't need God to enlighten us about what is good and what is bad. But again, I ask you, how's it working for us? How's it working for you personally? How's it working on a worldwide scale for us today? Paul says in Romans, he says, we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. Sometimes I hear people riff on this idea. They'll say something like, I know everything turns out for the good. But to my ears, that is pure nonsense. Tell that to the 10 million people who died in German concentration camps in World War II. Tell them that everything works out for the good. When we riff and say, well, everything turns out for the good, we miss a critical point of what Paul is saying to us today. Paul says that the idea of all things working out for the good applies only to people who love God. People who have surrendered themselves to him. People who have renounced their claim to the right to themselves. People who have given this claim back to God. That's the people who ultimately can claim that all things work out for the good because God is at work in them. We're talking about people who step down from the authority seat of their own lives and have given God permission to step up in their life circumstances. And if you haven't given God permission to do this, if you haven't begun to step off that throne of your life today, then there's no place for God to step up. And God cannot make all things turn out for the good in your life circumstances. It's in the surrender to God that our life circumstances come under God's authority. And in that case, there is no such thing as chance. Everything is ordained. And God is ultimately orchestrating everything for your good. With someone who's still committed to being their own God, being their own moral agent in life, committed to sitting on the authority seat of their own circumstances, then the events of their life are essentially random. They are what we call underdetermined. We don't really understand how they work. We don't just know why things turn out the way they do. There's no rhyme or reason to why something happens here and it doesn't happen there. There's no reason to it. It's not that God refuses to love or care for those who are determined to live under their own authority. Of course not. God loves everyone. God loves everyone. God seeks his blessing and release for all people. God knows the implications and the consequences of what happens when people sit upon their own throne. And God does find ways to intersect his will with people who are committed to serving their own will in life. God finds a way of intersecting with them, intersecting with people who refuse to yield to him. But God will not overturn your claim to your right to yourself. He just won't do it. God's not going to fight with you to see who sits on that throne of your life, who sits on the authority seat of your life. God is not going to fight with you about that. It's something you're going to have to voluntarily yield to him. You're going to have to surrender that part of yourself to God. See, God's not going to force himself upon your throne. He's only going to step up when you're ready to step down. And once we do step down, God will come and sit upon the throne of your life today. And his providence will begin to work out its will in your life. In a new way, he's going to bring us into circumstances that we don't understand in the moment at all, but which by faith we believe is being worked out for good. God brings you and me into places among people and into certain conditions to accomplish a definite purpose through the intercession of the Spirit in us, even though we don't always understand the meaning behind it all. And we don't understand the purpose that's being realized through our life circumstances. Remember, we don't really know what is good for us, and we don't really know what is bad for us in the moment. I've had many situations in my own life that in the moment seemed horrible, awful, terrible. Sometimes they really were, too. And if I were left to my own devices, I would interpret them as evil, destructive, life-negating. It's only later when I look back that I begin to understand that what was in the moment, something that was perceived by me as bad, was actually being orchestrated by God into something good. God was at work in my circumstances, and I needed to stay the course and not course correct myself in order to reap God's full blessing. See, the key for us today is never to put ourselves in front of our own life circumstances. Never to rise to the temptation of saying, I'm going to be my own providence here in this situation. I'm going to watch this situation very closely. I'm going to try to protect myself from it or avoid it or circumvent around it. I sometimes imagine life is like driving along a highway and God is trying to get us to take an exit in a new direction. I've got a little picture up there. You could put your own name up there if you want, yeah. And we keep going by the interchange, and, God has to kind of get us, this sign keeps repeating itself until I'm ready to take the turn off. Right? We keep frustrating God, but God's patient with us. We keep frustrating God by wanting to be our own providences in life because we think we know better. When we confess, like Paul, that God is working all things for the good, it is an acknowledgement that all our circumstances are in the hands of God. All of them. All of them. Everything you're dealing with today is in God's hands. And therefore, we don't ever have to think that they're unnatural or unique to us. And our task in life is not to agonize about our circumstances, but to pray within them. For ourselves and for others too. We're to use the everyday circumstances and the people God puts around us and to bring it all before Him. This makes me think of an old Gaither song called Something Beautiful. Anybody know that song at all? Anybody ever heard that song? Yeah, it goes, here, I got the words there for you. I'll sing it for you. It goes like this. Something beautiful, something good. Oh, my confusion, he understood. All I had to offer him was brokenness and strife, but he made something beautiful of my life. Do you believe that? Do you really believe that? Do you believe God is taking all the calamity and tragedy of your life, the pain, suffering that you've gone through? He's taking all the disappointment and even your bad decisions, and he's orchestrating it for the good. Do you believe that? Do you believe he's going to make something beautiful out of your life? I believe it. Paul obviously believes it too. And he's encouraging us today to cooperate with God, to embark on the path of surrendering ourselves in a certain kind of way to the Lord. Don't frustrate God's working in you by being your own amateur providence in your life or in the life of other people around you. And it's when life gets hard, when it gets difficult, that we're most tempted to put our lives again under our own management. But of course, that's exactly the wrong move. God has a plan for you and for me too. And all we need to do is work with him. Allow God the freedom to do his magic in our lives. So let's step down and allow God the freedom to step up and get moving in our life circumstances. Once the Lord is seated on your throne, no matter what happens, we can trust that he is taking all things into hand and orchestrating them for the good. And remember, God's target is eternity. He's working out our good with the eternal perspective in mind. And that means that the good that God is up to in your life and in mine is truly great.